It was a sedition.
It was lawless.
conspiracy.
It was lawless. There was property destroyed. There was trespassing. There were people injured. Those are all crimes.
Thankfully, numerous courts and juries have disagreed with you and have found many of those insurrectionists guilty. It was an act of domestic terrorism, and I thank you for clarifying for all of us here that you can't decide whether it was or not. I want to go to you, Mr. Williams, because I think that we need to be very careful here. Nobody really wants members of Congress or politicians jumping into ongoing criminal investigations for many good reasons that I think you lay out in your testimony. Can you give us just a few reasons of why it would be a major problem for criminal investigations to suddenly be subject to the whim of a politician?
I'd say 3 reasons, Congressman Allred, and thank you for that question. One, as articulated in the letter by the Deputy Attorney General that was quoted by, I believe it was Congressman Rassman earlier, you do not want the public to get a roadmap for how investigation is going to play out. That involves tipping off witnesses or defendants who might be brought into the system. So that's point one. You just don't want to give the roadmap, and that's the word used by the Justice Department. Number 2, and this is a big one, the fear of influence or the appearance of influence. If a prosecution continues right after a member of Congress or someone speaks out, the public is left with the perception that Congress, in effect, had its thumb on the scale of a federal prosecution, and that's problematic. And finally, everyone is entitled to a presumption of innocence. The Justice Department takes very seriously the idea that naming or outing people who are not themselves yet criminal defendants is incredibly problematic, dangerous, in a profound manner. So
Thank you, Mr. Williams. I yield back.
I think the gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Bishop.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Turley, I saw the effort to discredit you by a member on the other side sort of go down in flames. I don't think much else needs to be said about that. But, you know, I think what is interesting about what you've written and then in your testimony about the Twitter files and your tentative conclusion about what they may indicate is a product, first it bears repeating. I mean, you said there that it, quote, could well constitute the largest censorship program ever run by the government of the United States. And I think what attracts you is there is a body of evidence. It is not accusations, it is evidence that we would not have but for the voluntary, it may be extraordinarily unlikely, voluntary act of a very wealthy American who had the will and interest to purchase that company and then disclose what its files hold. Here's what's notable. We didn't get any information about what the FBI and the CIA and the ODNI and GEC and all these other agencies are engaged in from those agencies. The American people wouldn't know but for Elon Musk's disclosures and the independent journalists who then used them. You've talked a little bit in response to earlier questions about how there might be enough evidence there, or in other evidence we might be able to get of like kind, to suggest an agency relationship between the United States government agencies, the FBI, and these social media platforms that would cross a First Amendment line and violate the rights of Americans whose content was flagged for taken down. And that may well be, but it seems to me there's another angle to this. Everybody knows in the debate over big tech that these social media platforms have content moderation policies that are narrower than the First Amendment. They take down speech as a matter of practice that the First Amendment would protect if it were a government. In fact, a lot of people say, well, they can do that, they're private businesses. The question that gets at me is this: how could the FBI, which is sworn to protect the Constitution, ever justify using intense application of its resources, agents, et cetera, to urge social media platforms to use those standards to take down speech that the Constitution protects?
Yeah, this goes to the sort of bifurcated issue here legally. That is, you have on one hand the question of the agency relationship, which actually some courts like the 8th Circuit and Dawson, the 6th Circuit and Page have had analogous cases where they said that there was an agency when a government official made a call and negative actions were taken. But there's also the direct action. Obviously, federal agents are government actors. And in these cases, you have the agency identifying American citizens and others for their viewpoints and saying, we think these people should be suspended or removed. And as I say in my testimony, it's a particularly ominous thing to have the chief law enforcement agency performing this role, an agency with incredible powers. But this wasn't the normal situation of a public affairs office where someone says, look, the FBI did this, and the public affairs office says, you know what, that was a state raid. We weren't even in that issue.
They did it in private.
Right, here you had the government itself looking for citizens who should be silenced and targeted. That's a problem in and of itself, whether it also triggers an agency relationship. Do we want to go back to the day when governments created those types of lists?
Let me get you to comment on something else that I believe is ominous. It's on the charts behind me. One of the Twitter file disclosures is that Elvis Chan at the FBI San Francisco wrote to a Twitter executive and said, my colleagues at the fort had a query for you. Turns out they had to tell me that means Fort Meade, the National Security Agency, NSA probably. A few years ago, Twitter said they would no longer provide their data feed to members of the IC. That means intelligence community. And he goes on to ask whether colleagues at the NSA want to know if they'd reconsider that, because the NSA would like to vacuum up every word mentioned on Twitter by American citizens to be analyzed by computers to figure out what they would make of it. What about that? You don't comment on that in your comment. I'm curious what your impression is of that.
Well, that's another troubling aspect of this interstitial relationship between the government and social media companies. Now, on some occasions, the social media companies said, we're not going to do that. But all these different layers of interaction that the Twitter files refer to make it harder and harder to discern where the government ends and the social media company begins. And I want to emphasize that when I talk about the largest censorship system in history, that is really unquestionable, right? Even Twitter alone is a massive censorship system. You combine the other companies. Now, it is privately run, and now we're looking at how much of that was being directed or influenced by the United States government. But we are, without question, talking about the world's largest censorship system. And when you add elements like the one that you talked about, of this sort of interstitial relationship or cross-pollination between agencies and social media, it becomes a very menacing prospect. These companies are enormously powerful. They control much of our political speech. And as we talk about the dangers to democracy, and I agree with many of the Democratic members and the Republican members about the need to protect our democracy, that's a threat to democracy. When you have the ability of people to speak and control of companies that are using standards that are really undiscernible. Yesterday, when we heard the testimony of one of the Twitter executives, she gave a standard for which they would decide what could be censored. I wrote about it today on the blog. That standard defies definition. And I will simply say that the greatest danger of the First Amendment is the chilling effect, the unknown of when you will be targeted.
I regret my time's expired, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. We now recognize the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Chairman, I just promoted you this afternoon.
Been called worse.
And it did not take 15 rounds of voting to do it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our ranking member for her steadfast leadership in pursuing truth and protecting our democracy. The federal government has a long history of weaponizing its power against minorities like communities of color, religious minorities, and immigrant communities. Women, Latinos, people of color, and religious minorities are the actual victims of a weaponized government, not billionaires or politicians with frail egos. House Democrats spent 4 years fighting to enhance civil rights and liberties and stop the weaponization of government against our most vulnerable communities. Now my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have assembled this misnamed and misguided committee to grandstand and to try to lecture us all on the weaponization of government. But the American people know that this committee and MAGA Republicans are all about all show and no substance, or as we say in Texas, all hat and no cattle. This committee is designed to inject extremist politics into the justice system and to shield the MAGA movement from the legal consequences of their actions. These political stunts undermine our every agent, officer, prosecutor, law enforcement, and the entire justice system. We should instead dedicate some time to oversee direct interference in prosecutions and investigations. We should instead dedicate our efforts to investigating the abuse of power, the president's pardon power by the former twice impeached president. We should instead dedicate time and efforts to investigate the weaponization of the federal government to undermine and overturn the 2020 presidential election. I hope, Mr. Chairman, that we will have follow-up hearings to do some of that. Now I ask for unanimous consent to enter a letter from Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, outlining these and other recommendations for this committee into the record. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. During the assault on the Capitol, which we've already discussed, many of us, including myself, were removed from the floor and evacuated. A lot of things happened, and I, for one, consider it more than just a riot. Some have suggested that this committee may try to erase the truth about the horrible days of that event. The idea of denying the truth about January 6th is horribly offensive to me, and I'm sure that it's even more offensive to the law enforcement officers who were on duty that day. Mr. Williams, I know you're familiar with that day, and you're familiar with the halls of Congress. You worked on the Hill, correct?
I did, Congressman, thanks.
Were you there on the Hill on January 6th?
I was not present on the Hill on January 6th.
Do you know others who were?
I certainly do.
Can you understand why it would be offensive to the people who were there, many like me who were on the floor and got pulled out, had to try to put on a gas mask and told to hit the floor? And of course, the many law enforcement officers who had to rise to the duty. Can you figure any way that we could defend this if anyone tries to rewrite what happened that day?
It's the second part of your sentence that I want to pick up on, Congressman, because it's not just former colleagues and friends of mine that were here. It is law enforcement officers that I know, and there simply is no place for threats against law enforcement in a civil society. So I will echo everything you said. It was real. 1,000 people have been charged with crimes. Several have been convicted of very serious crimes. It was a real event.
So what is your reaction to the politicization of January the 6th?
I think, as a general matter, Congress works at its best when working in a bipartisan manner, and I think that becomes even more acute when talking about violent crime or threats or terrorism, as the word was used here, or even acts of insurrection.
Right, so you do agree that it is domestic terrorism?
My former federal prosecutor friend at the end, we'd share this. There's no domestic federal terrorism statute. I want to be careful in how I talk about that. Now, certainly, there are acts that comprise what would constitute terrorism, violent crimes, and so on, that might fit under that definition. But another thing for Congress to consider, if it wishes to, is to pass a domestic terrorism statute.
All right, are any of the investigations contemplated by this subcommittee comparable to the scale to the investigation of the attack of the Capitol?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch the question, Congressman.
Are any of the investigations contemplated by the subcommittee comparable in scale to the investigation into the attack of the Capitol?
I'm not certain as to what the committee's full mandate is, but to be clear, what happened on the day of the Capitol was a historic event that ought never happen again, and perhaps it's in Congress's interest to work toward that.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Lady yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Koenig.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I can actually answer that question. This committee is different in the sense that we allowed our minority party to appoint their representatives to the panel. So we'll start there. Examining the ways that the federal government abuses its power when dealing with everyday citizens it sees as threatening is some of the most powerful and consequential work that a member of Congress can do. During the federal government's very first Congress, the representatives in the House began granting authorities to federal agencies. These members were well experienced in the growth and abuses of a tyrannical government. The inherent quality of all governments is to collect more power and authority. But there is an inverse relationship to the power of government and the freedom of the individual. That is why James Madison, along with other like-minded members of the House, as well as President Washington, encouraged the passage of a Bill of Rights, defined, enumerated rights that citizens of our new nation could point to when governments begin to trifle with their lives, their businesses, or their faith. They passed the Bill of Rights in the first session of the first Congress, arguably the most important action ever done by this body for the American people. Their actions were revolutionary. No government on earth has a founding document that has aged as well as ours. It is the oldest and least amended constitution in the world. And what we are charged to do on this committee is defend it against all enemies, foreign and domestic, to ensure that our citizens' life, liberty, and property are protected from the warrantless abuses of federal bureaus and their agents. Today, we are answering the call to investigate and ultimately stop the litany of dangerous and unconstitutional actions. Truthfully, the list is exhausting, and I'm sure that there is far more that we can address here today, or even in the 2 years that we have. So while Washington, Madison, and Jefferson are no longer here to help guide us in this body, their spirit lives on. It is absolutely crucial that we today take up this mantle. It is the work that will be done by this committee, not as Republicans, not as Democrats, but as Americans, that is important and will live on. Mr. Williams, you just told this committee to be cute, quote, "You get more flies with honey than vinegar." On your Twitter feed, you called the January 6th Select Committee to publicly hammer and shame former Deputy Attorney General Jeff Clark on everything that he attempts to plead the Fifth about. Is that your version of honey or vinegar?
That's my version of stating when an individual has provided.
No, just honey or vinegar.
I don't think it's a binary.
Okay,
If you look at the
all right.
context
So
of
you
all of my
also
tweets.
just told Representative Sanchez a few minutes ago that one of the hallmarks of good oversight is bipartisan, and it's designed to, quote, improve government process, end quote. You went on to say that threats are not protected speech. You yourself were extraordinarily critical of Justice Brett Kavanaugh, going so far as to say publicly on your Twitter feed, and you were not shadow banned, however, but when you said this, that the FBI dropped the ball when vetting him. When there was an assassination attempt on his life, you were unusually quiet. Up to that point, you had tweeted about him 17 times. I hope you, along with our Democratic colleagues, would agree that violence in political discourse is unacceptable, and I would encourage you to do better. That's a statement, not a question. Moving on. Professor Turley, the Constitution was written to limit the power of the federal government and to protect the rights of citizens, yes or no?
Yes.
You've written extensively about the abuses of the federal government. Would you say that these abuses occur within a variety of different agencies, yes or no?
Yes.
Are there not massive national security implications as a result of the extensive amount of warrantless data collection by the federal government agencies, coupled with the disastrous track record that they have of leaks and breaches, that Americans are not only being targeted domestically by the agencies, but also by bad actors and foreign actors?
Well, there are massive constitutional concerns there with the collection of data. There's no question about that.
But with all the breaches and leaks,
Yes,
there is a national security implication, is there not?
There can be.
Thank you. It is publicly documented the reference of use of force capabilities within a litany of different agencies, including the Department of Education, the IRS, HHS, even the EPA. Can you detail why the capability, coupled with extensive warrantless data collection efforts of these agencies, should concern everyday Americans, and why agencies like the Department of Education and the EPA are purchasing millions of dollars worth of ammunition and tactical ballistic gear?
Well, I testified earlier on the use of national security letters and other means to get information below the warrant level. And that covers a huge amount of information that the government has gathered. And I thought there was actually fairly bipartisan support on that Democratic and Republican members were equally concerned about the circumvention of warrants in that sense. I think it's a very serious problem. And to the credit of social media companies, they actually have pushed back on this. I mean, one of the things in the Twitter files that I noted was that some of that dealt with these types of efforts to get access to social media companies. But most of the time, these companies are really hamstrung when they get these letters, and there's a lot of them, to turn over this information, and citizens are unaware of that. And a lot of what we have that we could hold most dearly in terms of private information is now on our cell phones, it's now on the cloud, and the government has really targeted the cloud. I mean, they're going after the cloud with non-warrants. And in the previous hearing, I was really gladdened because Democrats and Republicans joined together and said, this is a problem. And I think it still is a problem.
I appreciate it. My time has expired. I yield.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a committee menacingly called the weaponization of the federal government. Mr. Turley, have you ever worked for the federal government?
Yes.
What did you do?
I did a couple of years off and on with the NSA as a lowly intern. I also worked in the legislative branch in various capacities. I represented Congress in court.
That's not working for the federal government. You were an intern.
Well,
Okay.
no, I wasn't an intern. I was representing them.
I understand. You were an intern at NSA. That's the extent of your federal government experience. Is that
No,
right?
I think Congress is part of the federal government. And
You represented Congress. You didn't work for Congress.
well, they paid me. That's my standard. But also, I also worked for.
All right, I'm going to
I also
reclaim my
worked in
time. Let's move on because I have a lot to cover. You commented a lot on the First Amendment today. Do you think that Special Counsel Mueller's indictment of members of Russian intelligence for interfering with the 2016 election through social media was improperly charged?
Well, it depends. I have to look at which case you're talking about, but I supported Mueller's appointment as special counsel.
I'm talking about the indictment.
Yeah, I wouldn't say, I don't remember being upset with those indictments. But
Well, what they did and what they alleged is that Russia interfered in our election through using speech via social media.
Right.
Now, do you think that the First Amendment protects people from making death threats against federal officials across state lines?
No, if it's a
Does the
criminal-
First Amendment protect someone from yelling fire in a movie theater?
Well, unfortunately, that one is not yes or no, because that's become a mantra for people. It's the Holmes-Schenck line. Holmes himself walked back on
All right,
that.
all right.
Holmes and
We don't need a law class here. But
so
you do agree, though, don't you, that the First Amendment does not protect all speech?
no, there are limits to speech. All constitutional rights have limits.
Right. Mr. Baker, I want to turn to you. When did you retire from the FBI?
I retired from FBI employment in about 20 years ago. And
1999, right? It's a year.
Yeah, and I've continued to be
So-
engaged with the FBI in a number of levels since then.
Okay. So you retired 2 years before 9/11, right?
That's correct.
Right. And are you aware that one of the reasons that 9/11 occurred was that the FBI and the intelligence community did not coordinate sufficiently? Do you agree with that?
That's a conclusion of the September 11th Commission, and it's very valid, I think.
And so you read that like I did, and that's all the information that you had because you were
Yes.
not at the FBI.
And
And
what's
as a result of 9/11, that the Department of Homeland Security was created, right?
A year or two after that, yes.
So you never worked in conjunction with the Department of Homeland Security when you worked for the FBI, right?
I was working as a consultant during
When
most
you
of
worked
those
for the
years.
FBI, when you were paid by the FBI as a special agent, did you work with Homeland Security?
No, it didn't exist.
Okay. You never investigated foreign interference in our elections, did you?
No, I personally did not,
And you have no experience investigating Russia's efforts to interfere in our elections through cyber attacks and social media, do you?
other than what I've studied and researched.
Okay. And in 1999, when you left, did smartphones exist?
Of a sort.
Really?
Yes.
What?
Well, we had phones. We had phones in
Smartphones.
cars.
Do you know what a smartphone
we had,
is? Okay.
Well,
Did you ever do any search warrants for emails?
search warrants for emails? No, I did not.
Did you ever investigate domestic extremism?
Actually, yes. I investigated the Ku Klux Klan on many occasions.
Good.
I would
Did
call
you ever
those-
investigate any insurrections on the Capitol?
No, there was none.
Okay. And I appreciate that your service, sir, but you would agree that a lot has changed in the FBI in the 23 years since you left, correct?
Good and bad, and I have stayed engaged on a number of levels.
One last question, sir, for you. I read that your opening statement is actually an excerpt from your book. Is that right?
Well, it covers some of the same territory, yes.
Well, next time, make sure you give us a heads up and we can set up a table for you to have a book signing after this. Ms. Parker, real quick, do you think that you speak for, you said that Americans are concerned about the FBI. Do you think you speak for every American?
I do not speak for every American, but as a special agent who's been out in the field trying to conduct my job, it's very difficult when we don't have the buy-in of the American people, and a lot of Americans do not trust the FBI anymore because
Well,
of recent
unfortunately, my time is about up, but I will also say to you that I worked in the Department of Justice for 10 years alongside a lot of FBI special agents, and their biggest concern and the most damage to the morale of the FBI occurred after Donald Trump started attacking the FBI because he was being investigated by the FBI, and that is what this subcommittee is all about. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for yielding back. I disagree with his conclusion. We now recognize the gentleman from North Dakota, Mr. Armstrong.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Shouting fire in a crowded theater was dicta in a 1919 case by Schenck. It was overruled in 1969 by Brandenburg and put in an imminence requirement. So if we're going to continue to use it in this setting, whether it's the Twitter hearing yesterday or the hearing here today, let's at least get the law right. Secondly, as somebody who spent the first 10 years of my life defending criminal cases in both state and federal court, I think the genesis of the Garland memo is incredibly important. The point of the coordination between the DOJ, the Department of Education, and the National School Board Association was designed to create a federal nexus. Local school board incidents are prosecuted locally. We elect local sheriffs, we elect local prosecutors, we elect local judges. Only by fabricating a domestic terrorism nexus do you create a position where you can prosecute those cases in federal court. But I don't want to talk about that because I think we do have to talk about things more than the First Amendment. The timestamp data provides an intimate window into a person's life, revealing familial, political, professional, religious, and sexual associations. Only the few without cell phones could escape this tireless and absolute surveillance. Those are quotes from the Supreme Court's majority opinion in U.S. v. Carpenter. And while Carpenter is a limited ruling addressing warrantless monitoring of cell site locations under the Fourth Amendment, the court began considering whether the law needs to adjust to a digital world with extensive data collection and the analytical tools to operationalize that data. The federal government has realized the value of the massive amounts of commercial consumer data that is freely available on the open market. The data is produced to inform on aggregate population levels, but it also generates leads that produce investigations into individuals. In 2020, the CDC purchased cell phone location data from a data broker to monitor whether or not people went to church during quarantine. In 2020, the DoD obtains consumer data from a Muslim prayer app. In 2020, the Department of Homeland Security purchased cell phone location data to make enforcement decisions on the U.S.-Mexican border. In the summer of 2020 and the turn of the year in 2021, DOJ obtained cell phone location data on Black Lives Matter protests and every cell phone in and around the Capitol on January 6th. 2022, several law enforcement associations publicly opposed a bipartisan data privacy bill because it would disrupt the ability to easily obtain certain consumer data. And in 2023, just this week, the IRS proposed comparing a waiter's reported income from tips to the tip data that's submitted by their employing restaurant. You may agree with some of these, you may disagree with some of these, but here's the thing. None of these third-party data acquisitions required a warrant. The amount of data available either directly or through third parties is both astounding and terrifying. Combine that with the advance in technology like AI, facial recognition, and more that will allow aggregation, analysis, and identification, and we are fast approaching a surveillance state with no assurances other than the promises of our government that it will not abuse this